So the fear is that this could trigger a very strong Russian response. We saw yesterday that a residential area of the city of Zaporizhia, a major city in the south of the country, very close to the front lines, was hit. More than a dozen.
When we are being directly threatened by states with advanced military forces, the most effective way to deter them is to be ready.
The German government will provide all the financial resources the Bundeswehr needs to become the strongest conventional army in Europe.
War has returned to Europe in a way that many of us believe belongs to history rather than to the present. Decades after the Cold War, we told ourselves that the continent was safe, that the grand experiment of European unity and NATO's deterrence had created an era of peace that would last for generations. But in 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, those illusions shattered. We saw missiles raining down on Kiev, cities being reduced to ruins, and millions of families forced to flee into neighboring countries. In an instant, Europe was reminded that the old dangers had not gone away. But as the shock of war spread across the continent, another truth became clear. Even in the face of overwhelming military force, people refused to surrender. Ukrainians, from professional soldiers to ordinary civilians, resisted in every way they could, through armed defense, yes, but also through acts of non-violent defiance. Shopkeepers refused to serve occupiers, teachers continued to teach Ukrainian history despite Russian mandates, and local communities spread information despite censorship. These actions, though quieter than the thunder of artillery, mattered deeply. They echoed the very strategy that Gene Sharp, the foremost thinkers of nonviolent struggle, described in his book Making Europe Unconquerable. Sharp's idea was radical but practical, that a society, if properly prepared, could deny victory to any invader by refusing to cooperate, by making conquest too costly and governance impossible. The book was written during the Cold War when Europe faced the looming shadow of Soviet expansion, but its relevance today is striking. Once again, Europe faces the Kremlin willing to use force to redraw borders. And once again, Sharp's answers deserve to be heard. Key to making Europe secure lies not only in military power, but in the resilience of its people. To understand why Sharp's vision remains so urgent, we need to grasp the full spectrum of Russia's threat to Europe. The invasion of Ukraine was not an isolated event. It was part of a longer trajectory. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, sending troops to South Ossetia and Abkhazia. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, openly defying international law and shocking European governments that had grown complacent. And in 2022, Russia escalated its aggression into an all-out assault on Ukraine, bombing cities, seizing land, and seeking to overthrow a democratic government by force. But Russia's strategy is not limited to conventional war. It is hybrid by nature, blending multiple forms of pressure to weaken its adversaries. Cyber attacks are one example. The 2007 attacks on Estonia, the repeated hacks on Ukraine's power grid, and the infiltration of Western institutions show how Moscow uses the digital battlefield. Energy is another weapon. Pipelines and gas supplies have been cut off, threatening to create panic and division in Europe. Disinformation campaigns flood social media with conspiracy theories and lies, sowing mistrust and undermining democratic debate. Financial corruption and political influence operations seek to divide European unity from within. What all of this shows is that Russia's challenge to Europe is not simply a military one. It is a total strategy designed to weaken states without necessarily conquering them outright. And this is where traditional defense faces its limits. NATO's nuclear deterrent may prevent an outright attack on Western capitals, but it cannot stop disinformation from circulating on social media. Fighter jets and tanks cannot prevent a cyber attack from paralyzing hospitals. Missile defense systems cannot keep gas flowing to homes when Russia turns off the tap in the middle of winter. The battlefield has expanded beyond soldiers to include every citizen, every institution, every daily routine. For Western Europe, this means that the question of defense is not just about armies, but about societies. Military spending can only go so far. Even the wealthiest nations cannot endlessly pour money into tanks and sheds without undermining their social stability. And besides, weapons can be destroyed or bypassed. But what if, instead of focusing solely on deterring invasion, Europe focused on making invasion wins? What if conquest was rendered futile not by bigger armies, but by the refusal of people to be ruled? That is where Sharp's civilian defense comes in. Civilian defense is often misunderstood. It is not the same as spontaneous protest, nor is it naive idealism. It is a deliberate strategy, organized and prepared in advance, to make a society ungovernable to an occupier. Sharp compared it to conventional defense in that it requires planning, training, logistics, and discipline. But its weapons are not bullets, but strikes, boycotts, non-cooperation, and the collective will of the population. The principle is simple. An invader needs more than land, they need obedience. They need civil servants to carry out orders, workers to keep factories running, teachers to indoctrinate children, media to spread propaganda, and citizens to comply with laws. If all of these refuse, the occupier finds itself holding empty territory, like a shell without substance. It may control streets with tanks, but it cannot rule effectively. Imagine a scenario in practice. The Russian army invades a European state. They seize government buildings and declare a new administration, but the officials who should make that administration function refuse to serve. Records have been hidden, destroyed, or encrypted beyond access, leaving the occupier blind. Police officers resign en masse rather than enforce foreign decrees. Judges refuse to preside over show trials. Bureaucracy collapses not because it was destroyed by bombs, but because the people who make it work refuse to cooperate. At the same time, workers across the country strike. Factories stop production. Trains run late or not at all. Supply lines clog with delays, quotes, accidental misroutings, and breakdowns. Farmers refuse to sell crops to occupiers, leaving troops undersupplied. Shops close their doors, denying occupiers the ability to purchase or requisition goods. The economy turns into a desert of the invader. Communication networks spring up underground. Encrypted apps spread information outside the occupier's control. Pirate radio broadcasts instructions for non-violent action. Families pass messages hand to hand. Attempts to spread propaganda fall flat. Cultural institutions, churches, theaters, libraries become hubs of defiance, symbols of an identity the occupier cannot erase. Every act of non-cooperation chips away at the illusion of control. The occupier may respond with repression, arrests. Repression has limits. A handful of individuals can be silenced, but when whole communities resist together, repression only fuels defiance. The more brutal the occupier becomes, the more illegitimate they appear, both to the population and to the outside world. Historical precedents prove the power of such resistance. During World War II, when the Axis power occupied Denmark, nationwide strikes and acts of non-cooperation forced secessions. Danish civil servants refused to aid the occupiers, and the population protected Jewish people from deportation by smuggling them to safety. In Czechoslovakia, during the Prague Spring of 1968, non-violent defiance slowed Soviet attempts to consolidate power. In Poland, the solidarity movements of the 1980s undermined the Soviet-backed regime, not with weapons, but with strikes, underground publishing, and mass protests. And today, in Ukraine, even in occupied territories, civilians have resisted Russian passports, engaged in sabotage, and maintained their national identity in defiance of foreign rule. Sharp's vision was to institutionalize this kind of resistance, to prepare for it in advance. Civilian defense would be taught in schools, rehearsed in communities, and integrated into national planning. It would be as systematic as military defense, a focus on resilience rather than force. The goal would be not to win battles, but to make conquest impossible by denying cooperation at every level. Why does this matter for us now? Because the threats we face in Europe today are not hypothetical. They are real, present, and ongoing. Russia is already conducting hybrid warfare across the continent. Cyber attacks are constant. In 1 year alone, European institutions face thousands of attempts to breach their systems. Energy blackmail has already caused massive disruptions. Disinformation campaigns flood social media, spreading lies that undermine elections and pit citizens against one another. These are not acts of open war, but they are acts of aggression, and they target the fabric of our societies. Civilian defense offers resilience against exactly these threats. A society trained in critical thinking and resistant to propaganda cannot be manipulated as easily by disinformation. Communities prepared to organize under pressure can keep essential services running, even when infrastructure is attacked. Workers aware of their collective power can resist attempts to coerce through economic means. Civilian defense equips citizens to respond not just to invasion, but to every form of hybrid attack. It is also cost-effective. Building vast arsenals of weapons is enormously expensive. Civilian defense requires investment. It does not require endless budgets. It builds strength through training, education, and organization rather than hardware, and in doing so, it makes democracy stronger. because civilian defense is not passive, it requires active participation. It turns citizens from bystanders into defenders of their own freedom. As Western Europe embraces civilian defense, we may see an era where invasions become futile, where conquest becomes impossible, not because armies are vast, but because societies are unbreakable. That is the task before us, to prepare, to train, to unite, to make ourselves unconquerable. Because in the end, true power lies not in the barrel of a gun, but in the collective will of people to remain free.